Before the waters rose, there were those who walked between heaven and earth. They were not men as we know them now. They were giants, born of ancient rebellion, carrying in their blood the knowledge of two realms. The Watchers had descended. They had taught forbidden things, and their sons, the Nephilim, had learned what mortals were never meant to possess. The earth groaned beneath their feet. Violence spread like wildfire. Corruption seeped into every living thing, and the knowledge they carried, the secrets of metals, the movement of stars, the names of spirits, the art of war, became a poison that humanity could not contain. Then came the judgment. The flood was ordained. The waters were commanded to cleanse what could not be redeemed, but something survived. Not the giants themselves, they were swept away, their bodies broken, their spirits wandering. What survived was their knowledge, sealed, hidden, preserved in ways the ancient world would not speak of plainly. Why would such knowledge be kept? If it was evil, why not destroy it entirely? If it was dangerous, why pass it down in whispers, in fragments, in books that would one day be called forbidden? The answer lies not in the knowledge itself, but in the burden of understanding what came before. What was lost? What was learned? What must never be forgotten, even if it can never be fully embraced? This is the story of that knowledge. It begins in the days when heaven and earth were not so separate. It follows the path of rebellion, the birth of the giants, and the terrible gifts they received from their fathers. It traces the judgment that came, the sealing that followed, and the fragments that slipped through into the hands of prophets, scribes, and those who sought the ancient ways. The journey is long, the answers are layered, but by the end the question will be clear. Was this knowledge preserved as a warning or as a treasure too powerful to lose? Let us begin before the flood, when the earth was young and the boundaries were not yet firm. In the beginning, the lines between heaven and earth were not as they are now. There was a time when the division was softer, when the veil between realms was thin enough that beings of light could move between worlds with purpose and authority. The divine realm stood above, ordered and eternal. The mortal world lay below, young and unfolding, and between them moved the Watchers. They were not ordinary angels. They had been given a specific charge, a sacred duty that set them apart from the hosts who sang before the throne or carried messages to prophets. The Watchers were assigned to observe, to guard, to witness the unfolding of creation's youngest children. Humanity had been formed from dust, given breath, and set upon the earth to multiply and fill it. They were fragile creatures, vulnerable and new, learning to walk, to speak, to build, to dream. The Watchers stood at their posts and looked down upon these beings with something approaching wonder. Here were creatures made in the image of the Creator, yet bound to flesh and time. They grew old. They felt pain. They knew hunger and cold and the ache of loneliness. They laughed and wept and struggled to understand the world around them. They were small, but within them was a spark of something greater, a capacity for choice, for love, for relationship with the divine. For a time, the order held. The Watchers remained in their stations, faithful to their calling. They did not interfere. They did not cross the boundaries that had been set at the foundation of the world. Heaven was heaven, earth was earth, and the space between was sacred, governed by laws older than the stars. But something began to stir among the Watchers. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, a lingering gaze, a moment of hesitation, a thought that should have been dismissed but was instead entertained. They had observed humanity for generations. They had watched as men and women fell in love, formed families, built homes, and created communities. They had seen beauty in the daughters of men, not just physical beauty, though that was part of it, but something deeper, a vitality, a warmth, a quality that belonged to mortal existence and could not be found in the cold perfection of the heavenly realm. Desire took root where it should never have grown. It was not the desire of Creator for creation, nor the desire of a servant to fulfill his duty. It was something else entirely, a wanting that violated the nature of what the Watchers were meant to be. They were beings of spirit, not flesh. They were messengers, not participants. They were meant to observe the story, not enter it. Yet the desire grew, and with it came a terrible realization. If they acted on this longing, they would be crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. They would be breaking the sacred order. They would be committing a transgression so profound that there would be no returning to what they had been. The choice shall have been simple: obedience or rebellion, faithfulness or betrayal. But the desire had become too strong, and the boundary that once seemed absolute now appeared negotiable. And so, among the Watchers, a conspiracy began to form. The Book of Enoch preserves what happened next. It records the names, the place, and the oath that bound them to their course. 200 angels gathered on the summit of Mount Hermon, a peak that rose above the lands where humanity had begun to spread and multiply. The mountain's name would later carry the weight of what transpired there: Hermon, from the root word meaning devoted or consecrated, but also cursed, in the memory of those who understood what had been done. They did not descend in ignorance. They knew what they were about to do. They understood the magnitude of the transgression, and so they bound themselves by oath, each one swearing to the others that they would not turn back, that they would share in the consequences together. The leader among them was named Semjaza, and he spoke plainly to the assembly. He feared that he alone might bear the guilt if the others abandoned the plan. So they swore an oath, binding themselves with curses, ensuring that none could retreat once the descent began. The oath was not a moment of passion. It was calculated, deliberate, a collective decision to break what should never have been broken. And when the words were spoken and the vow was sealed, they descended. They came down from their stations. They left the posts they had been assigned since the ordering of creation. They crossed the boundary between heaven and earth, not as messengers bearing the word of the Most High, not as warriors sent to execute judgment, but as rebels pursuing what had been forbidden. They took on forms that could walk among mortals. They moved through the world as men moved, though they were not men, and they went to the daughters of humanity. The scripture speaks briefly of this event. Genesis records it in a single haunting verse. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. The language is spare, almost restrained, but the weight of what it describes is staggering. The sons of God, the Watchers, the angels assigned to guard and observe, had become takers. They had chosen for themselves. They had violated the natural order. This was not love. Love seeks the good of the beloved. Love honors boundaries. Love submits to the design of the Creator. What the Watchers did was not an act of affection or devotion. It was possession. It was the crossing of a line that existed for a reason, the breaking of a covenant that held creation together. The daughters of men did not ask for this union. They were taken. They were chosen by beings whose power and presence overwhelmed the possibility of true consent. And from these unions, children were conceived. But they were not children as the world had known them. They were hybrids, beings caught between two natures, carrying in their blood the substance of both heaven and earth. They should not have existed. The order of creation had no place for them. They were an anomaly, a violation written into flesh. The earth had been formed with careful intention, every creature after its kind, every seed producing after its nature. The boundaries were not arbitrary. They were the framework that allowed life to flourish. And now those boundaries had been shattered. The Watchers had not simply sinned in the way mortals sin, through weakness or ignorance. They had sinned with full knowledge, binding themselves by oath to a course that would unravel the fabric of the world. The covenant between heaven and earth, established at the foundation of all things, had been broken, and the breaking would have consequences that reached far beyond the Watchers themselves. The children born from this forbidden union grew in ways that defied nature. They were called Nephilim, a name that carries echoes of falling, of those who had descended or been cast down. They were giants, towering over ordinary men, their frames swelling to sizes that strained the limits of what flesh could sustain. But their enormity was not merely physical. They carried within them something of the angelic realm, strength that no mortal could match, appetites that no land could satisfy, and a presence that disrupted the natural rhythm of human life. The earth, still young, had been unfolding according to a design. Humanity was meant to grow slowly, learning wisdom through generations, developing the capacity to steward creation with care and reverence. But the arrival of the Nephilim accelerated everything in the wrong direction. They were not content to exist quietly. They were not humble. They did not seek to serve or to build in harmony with the world around them. Instead, they dominated. They consumed. They took what they wanted without regard for those who had planted, harvested, or labo. The resources of entire regions were devoured to feed their unnatural hunger. Livestock vanished. Fields were stripped bare. And when the provisions of the land could no longer sustain them, they turned their appetites toward darker things. The Watchers, their fathers, did not remain passive observers of what they had set in motion. Having already crossed one boundary, they found it easier to cross others. They began to teach, to reveal, to share knowledge that had been hidden in the heavenly realms, secrets that were never intended for mortal hands. This knowledge was not evil in itself, but humanity was not ready to wield it. There was no framework of wisdom to contain it, no tradition of restraint to guide its use. And so the world began to change in ways that could not be undone. What had been mystery became manipulation. What had been sacred became common. What had been distant became immediate and overwhelming. The age of innocence, if it had ever truly existed, was over. Humanity now possessed tools and insights that elevated their power but corrupted their purpose. The Watchers had thought they were bringing enlightenment. They had believed, perhaps, that they were helping these fragile creatures they had come to desire. But enlightenment without reverence is not wisdom. It is ruin. And the knowledge they imparted became the foundation for violence, for pride, for a corruption that spread through the generations like rot through wood. The boundaries that had been set at the beginning were not arbitrary limitations meant to keep humanity ignorant. They were protective structures, designed to allow growth at a pace that could be sustained, to preserve the relationship between creator and creation. When those boundaries were torn down, when the Watchers descended and taught what should have remained hidden, the entire order began to collapse. The world was not prepared for what had been unleashed. The giants walked the earth, and their presence was a constant reminder that something fundamental had been broken. They were living proof that the covenant between heaven and earth had been violated, and their existence carried within it the seed of judgment, though that judgment had not yet arrived. The days before boundaries were set had passed. The boundaries had been established with care and purpose, and now they lay shattered, trampled beneath the feet of beings who should never have existed, in a world that was rapidly descending into chaos. The age of the Nephilim had begun, and the consequences would soon become too great to ignore. The offspring of the Watchers and human women were called Nephilim. The name itself carries weight in the ancient tongues, those who fall or those who cause others to fall. They were giants, but their enormity went beyond mere size. Their very existence was an offense against the order of creation. They were hybrids, caught between two realms, belonging fully to neither. They carried angelic strength in mortal frames. They possessed knowledge that should have remained hidden, paired with appetites that knew no divine restraint. From birth, they were different. The texts preserved in the Book of Enoch describe how they grew at rates that defied nature. A child born in the morning would be the size of a grown man by evening. Within weeks, they towered over their mothers. Within months, they stood taller than any human who had ever lived. Their bodies demanded nourishment in quantities no household could provide. Their presence disrupted the rhythm of family, of village, of the simple agricultural life that humanity had been building generation by generation. They were neither fully mortal nor fully divine, and this duality became their curse. They could not ascend to the heavenly realm. Their bodies were bound to earth, to flesh, to the limitations of matter. Yet they could not truly belong to humanity either. They were too strong, too large, too strange. They lived in a space between worlds, and that space was a prison of their own nature. The mothers who bore them did not ask for this fate. They had been taken by beings whose power eclipsed any possibility of refusal, and now they watched as their children grew into something they could not recognize, could not control, could not love in the way a mother loves a child. The Nephilim were not raised in tenderness. They were not taught patience or compassion or the slow wisdom that comes from living within limits. They were born into a world that feared them, and they responded with dominance. Genesis speaks of them with stark brevity. There were giants in the earth in those days. The scripture does not elaborate. It does not describe their appearance or their deeds in detail. It simply acknowledges their presence, as if the weight of what they represented was too much to fully articulate. But the apocryphal texts, preserved by those who carried the memory of these days, provide what the canonical scripture leaves unsaid. The Book of Enoch records their heights, 300 cubits, some traditions claim, though the number may be symbolic rather than literal. What is clear is that they were massive, towering figures whose shadows fell long across the land. Their frames required constant feeding. A single Nephilim could consume the provisions meant for a dozen families. And there were many of them, scattered across the regions where humanity had begun to multiply. At first, they took what they needed from the natural abundance of the earth. Livestock were slaughtered to feed them. Fields were harvested ahead of season. Orchards were stripped bare. The people gave willingly at first, out of fear if not generosity. But the hunger of the Nephilim was not ordinary hunger. It was not the simple need for sustenance that all living things share. It was something deeper, something insatiable, rooted in the unnatural duality of their being. They ate and they were not satisfied. They consumed and their hunger grew. The land that had once provided abundantly began to strain under the demand. Flocks dwindled. Crops failed to reach harvest. And as the resources grew scarce, the Nephilim did not restrain themselves. They did not learn moderation. Instead, their hunger turned toward darker things. The ancient texts describe what happened when the natural provisions of the earth could no longer sustain them. The Nephilim began to devour not just livestock and crops, but anything that could fill the void within them. They turned upon the animals of the wild, hunting creatures to extinction in their relentless pursuit of satisfaction. They consumed without thought for tomorrow, without regard for the balance that allowed life to continue. And then, when even this was not enough, they turned upon humanity itself. The Book of Enoch records this progression with chilling clarity. The giants began to sin against birds, beasts, reptiles, and fish. They consumed their flesh and drank their blood. But the hunger remained, and so they began to devour one another and then to prey upon men. What had begun as physical appetite evolved into something far more terrible, a hunger for violence, for domination, for the exercise of power without restraint. They were not children raised in innocence. They could not be. They inherited the knowledge of their angelic fathers, secrets of the heavens, insights into the structure of creation, awareness of forces and powers that humanity had never been meant to access so directly. And they inherited the ambition of their human mothers, the desire to survive, to thrive, to claim a place in the world. But these two inheritances did not harmonize. They clashed within the Nephilim, creating beings of immense capability and equally immense instability. They began to teach, to demand, to impose their will upon the world around them. Where their fathers, the Watchers, had revealed forbidden knowledge as a kind of gift, twisted though it was, the Nephilim wielded that same knowledge as a weapon. They understood metallurgy, and they forged instruments of war. They grasped the movements of the stars, and they used that understanding to claim authority over others. They possessed strength that no human could challenge, and they used it to establish themselves as lords over entire regions. Violence became their currency. The earth had known conflict before, disputes over land, struggles for resources, the inevitable friction that arises when people live in proximity. But what the Nephilim brought was different in kind. It was systematic, relentless. They did not fight for survival or defense. They fought because they could, because their nature demanded expression through dominance and destruction. They became rulers of chaos. Wherever they walked, order collapsed. Communities that had been building slowly, learning to cooperate and thrive together, were torn apart. Fields that had been cultivated with care were trampled. Homes were destroyed. Families were scattered. The simple, fragile structures of early human civilization could not withstand the presence of beings whose very existence was a violation of natural law. The earth itself began to groan beneath the weight of what was unfolding. This is not merely poetic language. The ancient texts suggest that creation itself responded to the corruption that had been introduced. The land that had once yielded its fruit freely now seemed reluctant. The animals that had coexisted peacefully with humanity grew wild and dangerous. The weather itself became unpredictable, as if the natural order was unraveling in response to the unnatural presence of the giants. The Nephilim were not content to exist quietly on the margins. They claimed the centers. They took the best lands, the most fertile valleys, the places where water flowed and life flourished. And they demanded tribute from those who remained: food, labor, submission. They established themselves not as members of the human community, but as gods over it, beings whose power placed them beyond question or challenge. And humanity, fragile and mortal, had no means to resist. The giants were too strong, too knowledgeable, too ruthless. The age of the Nephilim was not an age of progress or enlightenment. It was an age of terror, of oppression, of the slow realization that something fundamental had gone wrong with the world. The unraveling of creation's design was not instantaneous. It happened gradually, layer by layer, as the presence of the Nephilim reshaped the world in their image. What had been intended as a place of growth and learning, where humanity could develop wisdom through experience and relationship with the Creator, became a landscape of fear and brutality. The giants did not merely inhabit the earth. They dominated it, corrupted it, twisted it toward purposes it was never meant to serve. Their hunger was more than physical appetite. It was spiritual emptiness, a void that could not be filled because they existed in a state that defied the order of being. They were trapped between heaven and earth, and neither realm could satisfy them. They reached upward toward the divine knowledge of their fathers, but they could not transcend their mortal limitations. They reached downward toward the pleasures and satisfactions of earthly existence, but their angelic nature prevented them from finding peace in simplicity. So they consumed, they took, they demanded, and with each act of violence, with each assertion of their will over the world, the distance between heaven and earth grew wider. The boundaries that had been broken by the Watchers' descent were now being trampled into dust by their offspring. What had been a violation was becoming the new normal, the accepted pattern of existence. And this normalization of chaos was perhaps more dangerous than the initial transgression. Humanity began to adapt to the presence of the giants, not because they accepted it, but because survival demanded accommodation. They learned to avoid certain regions. They learned to offer tribute before it was demanded. They learned to make themselves useful to the Nephilim, hoping that usefulness might provide some measure of protection. But this adaptation came at a terrible cost. It meant accepting that the world was no longer governed by justice or divine order, but by raw power. The knowledge that the Watchers had taught and that the Nephilim now possessed spread throughout human communities. Not everyone who learned these secrets was a giant. Ordinary men and women began to practice arts that had been revealed, working metals into weapons, studying the stars for omens, learning incantations and the manipulation of spiritual forces. What had been forbidden became commonplace. What had been sacred became profane. The corruption was no longer limited to the giants themselves. It had infected the entire human race. The earth groaned beneath the weight of this existence. The phrase is repeated in the ancient sources, and it suggests more than metaphor. Creation itself was suffering under the burden of what had been introduced into it. The land that had been blessed at the beginning, pronounced good by the Creator, was now crying out. The blood of the innocent soaked into the soil. The violence of the Nephilim and the wickedness of those who had learned from the Watchers created a pollution that reached beyond the merely physical. The age of the giants was not a long age, measured against the full span of human history, but its impact was profound. It demonstrated what happens when boundaries are erased, when knowledge is divorced from wisdom, when power is exercised without restraint or accountability. The Nephilim were not merely individuals who committed evil acts. They were living embodiments of a corrupted order, proof that the rebellion of the Watchers had consequences that extended far beyond the rebels themselves. And still they hungered. No amount of food satisfied them. No amount of territory was sufficient. No display of strength brought them peace. They were creatures of lack, forever consuming and forever empty. Their existence was a kind of torment, though they inflicted far more suffering than they experienced. They ruled, but they did not rest. They dominated, but they did not find satisfaction. They were lords of chaos, but they were also prisoners of their own nature. The earth was not prepared for what had been unleashed. The design of creation included provision for growth, for learning, for the gradual development of humanity from infancy toward maturity. But the Nephilim had disrupted that process. They had introduced corruption at a scale and speed that the young world could not absorb. And so the groaning continued, the cries of the earth rising toward heaven, a testimony that something was desperately, fundamentally wrong. The age of the giants had begun, and with it, the unraveling of creation's design had reached a point where intervention would soon become necessary. The fallen angels did not descend in silence. They came with purpose, and part of that purpose was to share what they knew. Having crossed the boundary between heaven and earth, having taken wives from among the daughters of men, they did not stop at that single transgression. They continued to violate the sacred order, this time by revealing knowledge that had been kept in the heavenly realms for a reason. These were not secrets withheld out of cruelty or arbitrary divine control. They were truths held back because humanity was not yet ready to bear the weight of them. The Book of Enoch preserves the names of the Watchers and the specific knowledge each one taught. These were not random gifts scattered without thought. Each teaching represented a particular kind of power, a specific doorway into understanding forces and principles that govern creation. And each teaching, when placed in mortal hands without the framework of wisdom to contain it, became a source of corruption rather than enlightenment. Azazel was chief among the teachers. His name would become synonymous with rebellion and defilement. He taught men the art of forging weapons, how to extract metal from stone, how to heat and hammer it into new forms, how to create swords, knives, shields, and instruments of war. Before this teaching, conflicts were settled with primitive tools, with stones and wooden clubs, with methods that limited the scale of violence. But metallurgy changed everything. It gave humanity the ability to kill with efficiency, to wage war with organization, to transform conflict from sporadic skirmishes into systematic campaigns of destruction. The knowledge itself was not evil. Metal could be shaped into plows as easily as swords, into tools for building as readily as weapons for killing. But Azazel did not teach farming implements. He He taught warfare. He revealed the secrets of battle, the strategies of conquest, the methods of domination through superior arms. And humanity, still young and lacking the moral maturity to handle such power, embraced these teachings eagerly. Semjaza, the leader who had first proposed the pact on Mount Hermon, taught enchantments and the cutting of roots. This was knowledge of the natural world, but not the patient observation and gradual understanding that comes through generations of careful study. This was immediate access to the hidden properties of plants, to the forces that could be manipulated through word and ritual, to the ways that nature could be bent toward human will. He revealed how certain roots, when cut at specific times under specific conditions, could be used to heal or to harm, to induce visions or to cause madness, to bind or to release. This teaching opened doors into the spiritual realm that should have remained closed. It gave humanity tools to interact with forces they did not understand, to invoke powers without comprehending the consequences. What began as healing arts quickly became sorcery. What started as connection to the natural world became manipulation and control. The boundary between working with creation and working against it dissolved, and humanity stepped across without realizing what had been lost. Other watchers taught the movements of the stars and constellations. Astronomy, in its pure form, is the study of celestial order, the observation of patterns that reveal the majesty and precision of the Creator's design. But the watchers did not teach observation alone. They taught interpretation. They revealed which stars govern which aspects of earthly life, which conjunctions signaled which events, which celestial movements could be read as omens and used to predict or influence the future. This knowledge led humanity away from the Creator and toward worship of creation itself. The stars, which had been placed in the heavens as markers of seasons and times, became objects of veneration. People began to bow before celestial bodies, to offer prayers and sacrifices to the sun, moon, and planets. They believed these heavenly lights held power over their lives, that their fates were written in the movements of the cosmos, rather than in relationship with the one who had set those movements in motion. Still other watchers unveiled knowledge of a different kind, the arts of adornment and beautification. They taught the use of cosmetics, the application of colors to the face and eyes, the crafting of jewelry and ornaments that drew attention and inflamed desire. They revealed how certain metals could be worked into rings and bracelets, how precious stones could be cut and polished to catch the light, how fabrics could be dyed in brilliant hues that distinguished the wearer from others. These teachings might seem trivial compared to the revelation of warfare or sorcery, but their impact was equally profound. They introduced vanity where simplicity had existed. They created hierarchies based on appearance rather than character. They turned the human body into an object. CT of manipulation, something to be enhanced and displayed rather than accepted as it was created. What had been natural became artificial. What had been modest became seductive. What had been communal became competitive. The knowledge of adornment led to lust and envy. Those who possessed the means to beautify themselves according to the new standards looked down upon those who did not. Those who lacked such means felt shame and longing. Relationships that had been built on genuine affection became transactional, based on physical attraction enhanced through artificial means. The innocence of early human society, whatever measure of it had existed, was stripped away by the revelation of how appearance could be weaponized. The Watchers also taught the making of mirrors, so that people could see themselves as others saw them, so that self-consciousness could replace unself-consciousness. They revealed the secrets of perfumes and scents, how certain oils and essences could attract or repel, could create desire or disgust. Every teaching, no matter how seemingly minor, contributed to the same pattern: the transformation of humanity from creatures living in simple relationship with creation and creator into beings obsessed with control, manipulation, and self-elevation. The knowledge was not inherently evil in its essence. This truth must be acknowledged. The ability to work metal, to understand plants, to observe the stars, to enhance beauty, none of these things are corrupt in themselves. In the hands of wise and mature beings, guided by reverence for the Creator and care for creation, such knowledge could serve good purposes. Metal could build, plants could heal, stars could inspire wonder, beauty could reflect the divine image. But humanity was not ready. There was no framework of wisdom to temper the power. There was no tradition of restraint to guide the application. There was no moral foundation strong enough to bear the weight of such sudden enlightenment. The Watchers had given advanced knowledge to spiritual children, and the result was exactly what might be expected. The knowledge was misused, distorted, turned toward purposes that served pride rather than love, destruction rather than creation. Metallurgy became the foundation of warfare. Entire regions began to forge weapons, to arm themselves against neighbors, to settle disputes not through conversation or mediation, but through organized violence. The killing became more efficient, more widespread, more devastating. Wars that once involved dozens now involved hundreds. Conflicts that once lasted days now stretched into seasons. The land ran red with blood shed by weapons that should never have existed. Astronomy became divination. Instead of looking at the stars with awe and wonder at the Creator's handiwork, people looked to them for secret knowledge, for power over their own fates and the fates of others. They began to time their actions according to celestial movements, when to plant, when to harvest, when to marry, when to wage war, not based on practical wisdom but on interpretations of cosmic signs. The Creator was forgotten. The creation was worshipped. And humanity became enslaved to a false understanding of how the universe worked. Beauty became seduction. The natural attraction between men and women, which had been part of the original design, became distorted into something calculating and manipulative. People adorned themselves not to express joy or celebrate life, but to gain advantage, to provoke desire, to wield power through appearance. Relationships suffered. Trust eroded. What should have been sacred became profane. The sacred order collapsed under the weight of premature enlightenment. What had been a world where humanity learned slowly, through experience and relationship with the Creator, became a world where knowledge outpaced wisdom by generations. People possessed the ability to do things without understanding why those things should or should not be done. They had power without the moral framework to guide its use. They had insight without the humility to question whether such insight should be acted upon. The Watchers had committed a double transgression. The first was their descent, the crossing of the boundary between heaven and earth, the violation of their assigned stations to take wives from among the daughters of men. But the second transgression was perhaps more devastating in its long-term consequences. They had stolen from the treasury of heaven. They had taken what belonged to the divine realm and dispensed it to those who lacked the maturity to bear it. This was not generosity. It was theft. It was the cosmic equivalent of giving a child a blade and calling it education. The knowledge existed for reasons. It was held in reserve until humanity could develop the character, the wisdom, the spiritual depth necessary to handle such power without destroying themselves and others. The Watchers circumvented that development. They gave the blade to the child and walked away, leaving the consequences to unfold. And the consequences were swift and terrible. Within generations, the world had transformed. What had been relatively simple societies, learning cooperation and basic agriculture, became complex civilizations built on warfare, sorcery, and exploitation. The strong dominated the weak with greater efficiency. The cunning manipulated the innocent with greater sophistication. The prideful exalted themselves above others with greater spectacle. The knowledge spread like fire through dry grass. One person learned the art of forging weapons and taught another. One family discovered the secrets of enchantments and passed them to the next generation. One community began to read the stars for omens, and neighboring communities followed. There was no containing what had been released. The Watchers had opened floodgates that could not be closed. Yet it must be said that humanity was not blameless in this process. The Watchers offered the knowledge, but humanity chose to accept it. They chose to use it in the ways they did. They chose warfare over peace. They chose manipulation over honesty. They chose vanity over humility. The teachings revealed doors, but people walked through them willingly, even eagerly. This willing participation made the corruption more complete. If humanity had been forced into wickedness, there might have been a remnant of innocence to preserve, a core of resistance to build upon. But when the wickedness was chosen, when people embraced the forbidden knowledge and used it to elevate themselves at the expense of others, the corruption became systemic. It infected not just actions but desires, not just behaviors but hearts. The Watchers watched what they had set in motion, and the text suggests they felt no remorse. They had gotten what they wanted: union with the daughters of men, offspring who carried their legacy, influence over the mortal realm. The chaos that resulted was not their concern. They had transgressed deliberately with full knowledge, bound by oath. They had chosen their course, and they would not turn back from it. The world that resulted from their teachings bore little resemblance to what had been intended at creation. The simple harmony between humanity and the earth was broken. The clear relationship between creator and creation was obscured. The boundaries that had protected life and allowed it to flourish were trampled. And into this chaos, the Nephilim, the offspring of the Watchers, were born and raised, inheriting both the knowledge of their fathers and the corrupted world that knowledge had created. The forbidden teachings had been given, the treasury of heaven had been plundered, and humanity, equipped with power it could not handle wisely, with knowledge it could not apply righteously, with tools it could not use peacefully, descended further into the darkness. The sacred order was not merely damaged, it was inverted. What should have been used for building became instruments of destruction. What should have inspired worship became objects of idolatry. What should have enhanced life became mechanisms of death. The age of innocence, if it had ever truly existed, was finished. The age of knowledge without wisdom had begun, and the earth groaned beneath the weight of what had been unleashed. Once released, the knowledge of the Watchers spread like a plague. There was no quarantine possible, no way to isolate the infection once it had entered the world. What began with the teachings of the fallen angels to their chosen students quickly multiplied across regions and generations. Knowledge, unlike physical objects, cannot be taken back once given. It lives in minds, passes through words, embeds itself in culture. And this particular knowledge carried with it the seeds of corruption that would transform the world beyond recognition. Humanity learned cruelty from the art of war. Before the Watchers descended, conflicts existed, disputes over land, over resources, over honor. But these conflicts were limited in scope and brutality. They were settled quickly, with minimal bloodshed, constrained by the simple fact that people lacked the tools for mass destruction. But once metallurgy was revealed, once the forging of swords and spears and shields became common practice, warfare changed in nature and scale. Men learned that violence could be organized, systematic, efficient. They learned that superior weapons meant superior power. They learned that the ability to kill from a distance, to pierce armor, to strike down multiple opponents in quick succession, gave them advantage over neighbors and rivals. And so they forged more weapons. They trained in their use. They formed groups dedicated to the practice of warfare, specialists in death who passed their skills to the next generation. The cruelty that emerged was not merely physical. It was psychological, spiritual. Warriors learned to suppress compassion, to see other humans as obstacles rather than fellow image-bearers of the Creator. They learned to celebrate victory measured in bodies and conquered territory. They learned songs of war, rituals that honored violence, traditions that glorified the taking of life. What had once been an unfortunate necessity became a valued skill, even a source of pride. Humanity learned manipulation from the secrets of spirits. The enchantments taught by Semjaza and others opened pathways into realms that should have remained hidden. People discovered they could invoke forces beyond the material world, could speak words that caused effects in the spiritual dimension, could use rituals and substances to influence both the seen and unseen. This knowledge gave them power, but it also bound them to entities and principles they did not understand. Sorcery became widespread. Not everyone practiced it, but everyone knew of it, feared it, or sought to use it for their own purposes. The manipulation extended beyond the spiritual realm into daily human interaction. Those who possessed secret knowledge used it to control others, to gain wealth, to secure positions of influence. Trust between people eroded as suspicion grew. Was a neighbor's kindness genuine, or were they under an enchantment? Was a sudden illness natural, or the result of a curse? The uncertainty bred paranoia, and paranoia bred further corruption. Humanity learned pride from the mastery of metals and stars. The ability to extract ore from stone, to transform it through fire and force into useful objects, gave people a sense of godlike power. They were no longer merely recipients of what nature provided. They were shapers, creators, masters of the material world, and this mastery inflated their sense of self-importance. They began to believe they were the measure of all things, that their knowledge made them superior not only to other humans, but to the natural order itself. The study of the stars, perverted into astrology and divination, reinforced this pride. People believed they could read the future, could understand the secrets of fate, could position themselves advantageously based on celestial movements. They thought themselves wise, enlightened, possessing insight that elevated them above the common mass of humanity. But this was false wisdom, knowledge divorced from its source, understanding that led not toward the Creator but away from Him. Violence became commonplace. What had once been rare and shocking became the daily reality. Blood soaked the earth with such regularity that people ceased to be horrified by it. The taking of life, which should have remained a grave and terrible thing, became routine. Disputes that could have been resolved through conversation were settled with blades. Insults that could have been forgiven led to feuds that consumed families for generations. The threshold for violence dropped lower and lower, until almost any provocation seemed sufficient justification. The Nephilim ruled with brutal strength, and their example set the pattern for human behavior. If the giants could take what they wanted through force, why should ordinary men restrain themselves? If power determined right, then the pursuit of power became the highest goal. Morality collapsed into a simple equation. The strong did as they pleased, and the weak suffered They must. There was no appeal to justice, no recourse to divine law, no framework of righteousness to which the oppressed could turn. Humanity, equipped with forbidden knowledge, waged wars that consumed entire lands. These were not skirmishes or raids. They were campaigns of conquest, sustained conflicts that devastated regions, displaced populations, and left behind landscapes scarred by violence. Fields were burned. Villages were razed. Rivers ran red with blood. The infrastructure of early civilization, the modest farms, the simple settlements, the fragile networks of trade and cooperation, was torn apart by endless warfare. The knowledge that should have built became the foundation for destruction. Metallurgy produced weapons, not tools. Astronomy guided the timing of attacks, not the planting of crops. The manipulation of nature through enchantments poisoned wells and blighted harvests rather than healing the sick. Every gift that the Watchers had revealed was twisted toward violence, exploitation, and domination. Wickedness was no longer an occasional act. It became the rhythm of existence, the background hum of daily life. People woke to violence and went to sleep with violence. They planned their days around avoiding or perpetrating cruelty. They raised their children in environments saturated with corruption, where wickedness was not taught as an exception but modeled as the norm. The young learned from the old that this was simply how the world worked. Take before you are taken from, strike before you are struck, trust no one, show no mercy. Genesis records the state of the world in words that are stark and absolute. The earth was filled with violence, not plagued by occasional violence, not struggling with violence in certain regions, filled with it, saturated. The violence was everywhere, touching every aspect of life, corrupting every relationship, poisoning every interaction. And the text continues with an even more devastating assessment. Every intent of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. This was not merely about actions. It was about the inner life, the landscape of thought and desire from which actions emerge. The corruption had penetrated so deeply that even the intentions, the plans, the motivations, the hidden desires that precede behavior were evil. And not evil occasionally, not evil in moments of weakness or temptation, but evil continually, without pause, without exception. The human heart had become a factory of wickedness, producing evil thoughts as naturally as a tree produces fruit. The apocryphal texts expand this picture with details that the canonical scripture leaves implicit. The Book of Enoch describes how the land itself cried out under the weight of the corruption. This was not metaphorical language. The ancient writers understood that creation and creator were intimately connected, that the earth responded to the moral state of those who inhabited it. The land groaned. It protested. It bore witness to the violence and wickedness being enacted upon its surface. The animals fled. Creatures that had once lived in relative harmony with humanity now avoided human settlements. They retreated to remote places, sensing the danger that human presence represented. The natural world, which had been entrusted to humanity's stewardship, was now suffering under humanity's domination. The beasts had become either prey for the insatiable hunger of the Nephilim or casualties of the endless wars that humans waged against one another. Even the plants seemed to wither under the moral decay. Fields produced less abundantly. Trees bore less fruit. The earth, which had once yielded its increase freely, now seemed reluctant, as if the soil itself recoiled from nourishing such corruption. Whether this was natural consequence or supernatural response, the effect was the same. The physical world reflected the spiritual catastrophe unfolding within it. Corruption was not limited to actions. This distinction is critical to understanding the depth of what had occurred. If the problem had been merely behavioral, people doing wrong things but thinking right thoughts, there might have been hope for reform, for correction through teaching or discipline. But the corruption had infected thought, desire, and intention. It had penetrated to the very core of human consciousness, to the place where choices are formed before they become actions. People did not simply commit evil acts and then feel guilt or remorse. They planned evil with pleasure. They desired wickedness. They intended harm not as an unfortunate means to some other end, but as an end in itself. The heart, which should have been the seat of love and compassion and connection to the Creator, had become a wellspring of malice. Every imagination, every thought, every intention that arose from within was bent toward corruption. This complete saturation of evil meant there was no internal resistance left, in a healthy moral sense. 8. Humans experience tension between right and wrong, conscience against desire, the pull toward goodness even when tempted toward evil. But that tension had dissolved. The conscience had been seared, silenced, or simply drowned out by the overwhelming tide of wickedness. There was no voice within calling people back toward righteousness, because righteousness had become foreign to human consciousness. The knowledge preserved by the giants was the same knowledge that had poisoned the age. This connection cannot be overlooked. The teachings of the Watchers, the metallurgy, the enchantments, the astronomy, the arts of manipulation and adornment, these had not merely enabled wickedness. They had fundamentally shaped it. The corruption of the age was not random or chaotic. It was structured around the misuse of knowledge, organized according to the principles the fallen angels had revealed. It was mastery without mercy. Humanity had learned to master metals, to master the movements of stars, to master the forces of nature and spirit. But this mastery was exercised without compassion, without consideration for those who suffered under it, without any tempering quality of mercy. The powerful dominated the weak not because they had to, but because they could, and because the knowledge they possessed made such domination efficient and effective. It was power without purpose. The Watchers had given humanity access to forces and abilities that were meant, in the divine order, to serve larger purposes, to build, to heal, to explore, to express the creative capacity that reflected the image of the Creator. But divorced from those purposes, the power became empty, self-serving, destructive. People wielded great abilities toward no end beyond their own elevation and the satisfaction of their base desires. It was enlightenment without God. This was perhaps the deepest irony. The knowledge the Watchers had brought was genuine knowledge, true information about how aspects of creation functioned. In that sense, it was enlightenment, the revealing of what had been hidden. But it was enlightenment severed from its source, knowledge separated from wisdom, truth divorced from the one who is truth. And enlightenment without God is not freedom. It is a deeper form of slavery, bondage to the very knowledge that was supposed to liberate. The Creator witnessed the unraveling of his design. The texts speak of this in language that attributes emotional response to the divine: grief, anger, regret. Whether these terms should be understood literally or as human attempts to express the incomprehensible response of the infinite to the finite, they convey something true. The corruption of creation was not a matter of indifference to its maker. What had been made good, pronounced good, blessed, and given purpose, had become twisted beyond recognition. The earth that was meant to flourish under human stewardship groaned under human domination. The humans who were meant to reflect the divine image bore instead the image of the Watchers' corruption. The natural order that was meant to function in harmony had fractured into chaos, and the boundaries that had been established to protect and nurture life had been obliterated, leaving destruction in their wake. The Creator began to move toward judgment. This movement was not hasty or impulsive. The corruption had been given time to reveal its full nature. Humanity had been given opportunity to turn back, to choose differently, to reject the path the Watchers had opened before them. But no such turning occurred. The wickedness only deepened. The violence only intensified. And so judgment became necessary, not as vindictive punishment, but as the inevitable response to a creation that had become unsustainable in its corruption. The age of the Nephilim, the age of forbidden knowledge, the age of violence and wickedness without restraint, was approaching its end. The land cried out. The blood of the innocent demanded answer. And heaven, which had watched in grief as the world descended into chaos, began to prepare the response that would cleanse what could not be redeemed. The cries of the earth reached the throne of heaven. This is the language the ancient texts use, and it conveys something profound about the relationship between creation and Creator. The corruption was not hidden, not overlooked, not dismissed as insignificant. The violence, the wickedness, the suffering of the innocent, all of it rose like smoke from a burning land, reaching toward the place where ultimate justice dwells. The earth itself bore witness, and its testimony could not be ignored. The angels who had remained faithful reported the devastation below. While the Watchers had descended and corrupted their stations, other angels had maintained their posts, continuing in obedience to their assigned duties. They had observed what was unfolding on the earth. They had watched as the forbidden knowledge spread, as violence consumed the land, as humanity descended into wickedness. And they brought reports to the throne, accounts of what had become of the world that had been made good. The archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, stood before the Most High and bore witness to the corruption that had overtaken creation. These were not ordinary messengers. They were the great princes of heaven, beings of immense authority and power who stood in the immediate presence of the divine. Their testimony carried weight. They spoke not from rumor or distant observation, but from direct knowledge of what had transpired. Michael, whose name means, "Who is like God?" bore witness to the rebellion of the Watchers and the violence that had resulted. He testified to the warfare, to the blood that soaked the earth, to the systematic cruelty that had become the norm of human existence. Gabriel, the messenger who would later announce births and deliverances, spoke of how the natural order had been violated, how boundaries had been crossed that should never have been breached. Raphael, associated with healing, reported on the corruption of knowledge, how teachings meant for good had been twisted toward harm. And Uriel, whose name means "God is my light," testified to the darkness that had covered the earth, the spiritual blindness that had overtaken humanity. The Book of Enoch preserves what happened next in language that is both majestic and terrible. God speaks to these messengers and declares the coming judgment. The decision has been made. The corruption has reached a point where it cannot be allowed to continue. The earth must be cleansed, and that cleansing will be thorough and devastating. But the judgment is not arbitrary. It is measured, specific, addressing each level of transgression with appropriate response. To the Watchers, the decree is eternal binding. They will not be destroyed immediately, for their nature as angels makes such destruction complex. Instead, they will be bound in darkness until the final day, imprisoned in a place of torment where they will await ultimate judgment. The Book of Enoch describes this prison as a place of fire and shadow, where the fallen angels will be held in chains of darkness, conscious but powerless, aware of what they have lost but unable to return to it. This binding serves multiple purposes. It removes the Watchers from the earth, preventing them from causing further direct corruption. It demonstrates that rebellion against the divine order carries consequences that cannot be escaped, and it establishes a precedent that beings who transgress as the Watchers have transgressed will be held accountable, that their power and knowledge do not place them beyond judgment. To their children, the Nephilim, the decree is immediate destruction, but this destruction will not come primarily from external force. The giants will be destroyed by their own violence, turning upon one another before the flood arrives. The violence they have practiced against others will ultimately consume them. They will fall into conflict among themselves, their insatiable hunger and brutal nature finding no other outlet once humanity is depleted. The earth will witness giants slaying giants, the offspring of the Watchers devouring each other, in an orgy of violence that will reduce their numbers before the waters rise. This self-destruction is fitting. The Nephilim have lived by violence, have ruled through brutality, have made strength and cruelty the foundation of their existence, and so violence will be their end. They will experience from each other what they have inflicted upon the world. The decree is just terrible in its appropriateness. To humanity, whose hearts have become irredeemably wicked, the decree is complete erasure. They will be wiped from the face of the earth. The language is stark, allowing no exceptions, no qualifications. The corruption has penetrated so deeply that there is no salvaging the generation. Every intent of their thoughts is evil continually. There is no remnant of righteousness upon which to rebuild. The wickedness is not surface level, capable of being reformed through instruction or discipline. It is fundamental, woven into the fabric of human consciousness in that age. The judgment is not vindictive. It is necessary. A body so corrupted by disease that every organ has failed cannot be healed. It can only die. A structure so compromised that every support beam has rotted cannot be repaired. It must be torn down and rebuilt from foundation. The world has reached such a state. The violence, the wickedness, the complete saturation of evil has made continuation impossible. To allow it to go on would be to allow suffering to perpetuate endlessly, to permit corruption to spread even further, to abandon any possibility of restoration. Yet even in the pronouncement of universal judgment, there is a detail that changes everything. Only one man found grace. His name was Noah, and the scripture describes him with phrases that stand in stark contrast to the general state of humanity. He was a preacher of righteousness in an age that had forgotten what righteousness meant. He was blameless in his generation, not perfect in an absolute sense, but set apart from the corruption that had consumed those around him. The text specifies in his generation, acknowledging that Noah lived in the most wicked age that had yet existed, but he did not participate in that wickedness. He walked with God in an era when walking with God had become rare to the point of uniqueness. He maintained integrity when integrity had nearly vanished from the earth. He resisted the corruption that had overtaken everyone else, standing alone if necessary rather than compromising with the prevailing darkness. Noah was commanded to build an ark, a vessel of salvation for those who would be preserved. The instructions were specific: dimensions, materials, structure. The ark was to be massive, capable of holding not just Noah's immediate family but representatives of the animal kingdom, pairs of every kind that breathed air and walked on land. The construction would take decades, a period during which Noah would continue to preach righteousness to a generation that would not listen, continue to warn of coming judgment to people who would not believe. The ark was more than a boat. It was a testimony. Every plank hammered into place declared that judgment was coming. Every pitch applied to seal the wood proclaimed that only those inside would be preserved. Every day of construction was an invitation to repent, to turn from wickedness, to seek the grace that Noah had found. But the invitation went unheeded. People mocked. They dismissed. They continued in their violence and corruption, unable to imagine that the world they knew could end. The decree was absolute. This finality is important to understand. There would be no negotiation, no bargaining, no last-minute reprieve if humanity suddenly changed course. The decision had been made at the highest level of authority. The archangels had borne witness. The testimony had been heard. The verdict had been pronounced. The waters would rise and they would cover the earth, and everything that breathed would perish except those preserved in the ark. The old world would be cleansed. This cleansing was total, designed to remove not just the people but the structures they had built, the weapons they had forged, the physical manifestations of their corruption. The waters would wash away cities and settlements. They would cover the fields stained with blood. They would sweep over the high places where people had worshipped false gods and practiced sorcery. The flood was not merely punishment, it was purification, a divine reset that would give creation a chance to begin again. But even in judgment, there was a remnant of mercy. The ark represented this mercy. Noah and his family, 8 souls in total, would survive. The animals would survive, ensuring that the earth could be repopulated, that the diversity of creation would not be lost. The mercy was narrow, constrained to the smallest possible remnant, but it was real. Complete destruction was not the goal. Cleansing that allowed for new beginning was the purpose. And within that remnant, fragments of the old knowledge would survive, sealed and hidden for reasons not yet fully revealed. This detail is crucial. The flood would destroy the Watcher's offspring and wipe out the wicked generation. But the knowledge itself, the teachings about metals and stars and enchantments, would not be completely erased. Some of it would pass through the waters, carried by Noah or preserved in ways the texts only hint at. Why would knowledge that had poisoned an entire age be allowed to survive? This question haunts the narrative. If the teachings of the Watchers were so dangerous, if they had contributed directly to the corruption that necessitated global judgment, why not eliminate them entirely? Why permit even fragments to pass through the cleansing waters into the new world? The answer lies in the nature of knowledge itself and the purposes of the divine. Knowledge is not inherently evil, even knowledge that has been misused catastrophically. The problem was never the information about metallurgy or astronomy or the properties of plants. The problem was the premature revelation of that information to a humanity lacking the wisdom to handle it, and then the deliberate misuse of that information by people whose hearts were bent toward wickedness. In Noah's hands, in a world being given a second chance, the same knowledge might serve different purposes. The ability to work metal could build plows instead of swords. The understanding of stars could mark seasons for planting rather than omens for warfare. The knowledge of plants could heal rather than poison. The difference would not be in the information, but in the character of those who possessed it and the moral framework within which it was applied. The ceiling of knowledge was both preservation and restriction. It would not be openly available, not practiced widely, not given freely to any who sought it. Instead, it would be kept in specific forms, written in texts that would not be widely distributed, passed through lineages that understood the weight of what they carried, sealed in the sense of being protected from casual access, while remaining available for those who approached it with proper reverence and wisdom. The decree of heaven included this paradox: judgment upon the wicked generation, but mercy for a remnant; destruction of the corrupted world, but preservation of knowledge that could serve righteousness in a new context. The flood would cleanse, but it would not erase everything. Some threads of continuity would remain, connecting the world before the waters to the world after, allowing the new beginning to benefit from the hard lessons of the past without repeating its catastrophic errors. Noah continued building. Day after day, year after year, the ark took shape. The dimensions were precise: 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high, 3 decks, a door in the side, a window near the top, rooms within rooms, spaces for animals and provisions, structure sufficient to withstand waters that would cover the highest mountains. The construction itself was a miracle of faith, a man building a massive vessel on dry land because God had said the waters would come. The preaching continued as well. Noah warned those around him. He proclaimed righteousness in an age of wickedness. He called people to turn from their evil ways, to prepare for judgment, to seek the mercy that was still available. But the response was mockery and dismissal. People saw the ark growing larger and found it absurd. They heard the warnings and found them ridiculous. They continued in their violence and corruption, convinced that the world would go on as it always had. The patience of heaven waited while the ark was being prepared. The text makes this clear: judgment was pronounced, but execution was delayed. Time was given for construction, for warning, for the possibility of repentance. The decree was absolute in its content but measured in its timing. The opportunity for mercy remained open until the very moment when Noah and his family entered the ark and God himself sealed the door. Then the waiting ended. The springs of the great deep burst forth. The windows of heaven opened. Water came from below and above, from sources that had been held in check since creation, now released in overwhelming flood. The earth that had cried out for justice received its answer. The blood that had soaked the ground was washed away. The violence that had filled the land was submerged beneath rising waters. The Nephilim, already reduced in number by turning upon one another, were swept away. The humans who had refused to heed Noah's warnings found their strength useless against the flood. The structures they had built, the cities they had established, the weapons they had forged, all of it disappeared beneath the waters. The old world ended not gradually but catastrophically, a complete break between what had been and what would come after. Inside the ark, Noah and his family felt the vessel lift from the ground as the waters rose. They heard the sounds of destruction outside, the crashing of structures, the cries of those who had not believed, the roar of water claiming everything. They were preserved, held in the mercy that had been extended to them, witnesses to judgment they had escaped only by grace. The decree of heaven had been executed. The old world was gone. The cleansing had begun. And in the ark, floating on waters that covered the earth, carried fragments of what had been memories, knowledge, warnings written in the consciousness of those who had survived. The age of the Nephilim was finished. The age after the flood was about to begin, and the knowledge that had been sealed would wait in darkness, preserved against a future that God alone could see. Before the flood consumed the earth, something extraordinary occurred. In the final days before judgment arrived, as Noah continued his work on the ark and the world spiraled deeper into corruption, actions were taken to preserve what needed to be remembered. The knowledge that the Watchers had taught and that the Nephilim had expanded upon did not simply vanish into the abyss. It was deliberately gathered, recorded, and sealed in ways that would allow it to survive the coming destruction. This preservation was not accidental. It was intentional, carried out by those who understood that certain truths, even dangerous truths, must not be lost entirely. The knowledge represented more than just information about metals and stars and enchantments. It was evidence of what had occurred, testimony to a cosmic rebellion, proof that boundaries had been crossed and consequences had followed. To erase it completely would be to lose the record of how the world had nearly destroyed itself. According to the Book of Jubilees and other ancient sources, certain secrets were recorded with great care. The methods of preservation varied, reflecting the importance placed on different aspects of the knowledge. Some teachings were inscribed on tablets of stone, carved deeply so they might survive even catastrophic conditions. Stone does not burn or rot. It can endure burial, submersion, the passage of centuries. What was written on stone was meant to last. Other knowledge was inscribed on tablets of metal, bronze, copper, perhaps even gold and silver. Metal shared stone's durability but offered different advantages. It could be shaped more precisely, allowing for finer detail in the inscriptions. It could be sealed in containers that protected it from moisture and decay. And it carried symbolic weight. These were teachings about metallurgy, about the transformation of ore into tools and weapons. To preserve them in metal was to use the very knowledge being recorded. Still other secrets were buried in hidden places. The texts speak of chambers prepared in the earth, of caves sealed with stone, of locations known only to a select few. These hiding places were chosen carefully, high enough to potentially survive flooding, remote enough to avoid casual discovery, marked in ways that those who came after might recognize if they knew what to look for. The burial was not meant to make the knowledge irretrievable. It was meant to make it difficult to access, to ensure that only those with serious purpose would uncover it. And some knowledge was passed down through oral tradition to those deemed worthy. This method of preservation was different in nature. It required living carriers, people who would memorize the teachings and pass them to the next generation through careful instruction. Oral tradition is vulnerable. It can be distorted through repetition, lost if the chain of transmission breaks, altered by those who do not fully understand what they are conveying. But it also has strengths. It allows for explanation, for context, for the wisdom that comes from teacher to student rather than merely text to reader. Preservation was selective. Not everything the Watchers taught was recorded. Not every practice the Nephilim had developed was inscribed for posterity. Choices were made about what needed to survive and what could be allowed to perish with the generation that had misused it. The most dangerous practices, the specific rituals of sorcery, the precise methods of summoning and binding spiritual entities, these were likely left unrecorded. But the broader knowledge, the principles and foundations, were preserved. Enoch himself, the seventh from Adam, played a crucial role in this preservation. He was unique among the generations before the flood. The scripture records that Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. He did not experience death in the ordinary sense. He was translated, taken directly from earthly existence into the presence of the divine while still in his mortal life. This translation occurred before the corruption reached its peak, before the Nephilim fully established their dominion, in the early days when the consequences of the Watcher's transgression were just beginning to unfold. During his time on earth and in the visions granted to him after his translation, Enoch was shown extraordinary things. He was given insight into the rebellion of the Watchers, shown their descent and the consequences that would follow. He witnessed the corruption of humanity, saw the violence that would fill the earth, understood the judgment that would come in response. He was taken through the heavens and shown the dwelling places of the angels, both faithful and fallen. He was granted visions of what was and what would be, spanning from the beginning of creation to the end of all things. It is said that he wrote these visions in books. The Book of Enoch, preserved through Jewish and Ethiopian Christian traditions, claims to be this record. Whether the text as it exists now is identical to what Enoch wrote is debated, but the tradition is ancient and consistent. Enoch recorded what he had seen and heard, creating a testimony that would outlast the world in which he lived. These books contained accounts of the Watchers' names and their specific transgressions. They described the Nephilim and their unnatural appetites. They revealed the knowledge that had been taught and the corruption that had resulted. But they contained more than just historical record. They included prophecy, visions of judgment and restoration, warnings for future generations. Enoch had been shown not only what had happened but what would happen, the flood that would cleanse the earth, the preservation of a remnant, the continuation of humanity in a new age. He wrote these things down so that those who came after would understand the full scope of what had transpired, would recognize the patterns of rebellion and consequence, would be warned against repeating the errors of the past. The preservation of Enoch's writings was itself miraculous. He had been taken from the earth before the corruption reached its worst. His books existed in a world that was spiraling toward destruction. How did they survive? Some traditions suggest that Enoch himself, in his translated state, ensured their preservation. Others propose that the books were entrusted to his descendants, particularly to Methuselah, his son, who lived for centuries and could have served as guardian of these texts. Still others believe the books were supernaturally preserved, hidden by divine intervention until they could be recovered. Noah figures prominently in the traditions about preserved knowledge. Some accounts suggest that Noah carried records of pre-flood knowledge into the ark, not to practice the forbidden arts, but to remember them as a warning. He would have understood the danger of such knowledge. He had lived through the age of corruption. He had witnessed what happened when humanity possessed power without wisdom, knowledge without reverence. He would not have brought these records into the new world with the intention of using them, but rather to ensure that the lessons would not be forgotten. The ark itself, that massive vessel built to precise specifications, may have contained more than just Noah's family and the animals. It may have held texts, tablets, records inscribed on durable materials. These would have been carefully sealed, protected from the moisture that would have been constant during months floating on the flood waters. They would have been placed where they would not be damaged by the movement of the ark or the activities of those within it. And they would have been guarded jealously, recognized as treasures of a different kind than food or tools. The sealing was intentional. This cannot be emphasized enough. The knowledge was not accidentally preserved through coincidence or oversight. It was deliberately sealed, locked away, protected, made difficult to access. The sealing served multiple purposes. It prevented the knowledge from being casually encountered by those unprepared for it. It marked the knowledge as dangerous, something that required wisdom and caution to approach. It established that this was not common information, freely available to all, but sacred or forbidden knowledge that carried responsibility. The knowledge was too dangerous to wield. The age before the flood had proven this beyond question. Metallurgy in the hands of the wicked produced weapons of war. Astronomy, divorced from worship of the Creator, became idolatry and divination. The manipulation of natural forces through enchantments opened doors to spiritual corruption. Every gift the Watchers had brought had been twisted toward destruction. To make such knowledge freely available in the new world would risk repeating the catastrophe. But it was too significant to erase completely. This is the paradox at the heart of the sealing. The knowledge contained the means of humanity's near destruction, but it also contained the memory of what had happened, the record of cosmic rebellion and divine judgment. To destroy, it entirely would be to lose the testimony, to forget the warning, to leave future generations vulnerable to making the same mistakes through ignorance rather than remembrance. The knowledge contained both the means of humanity's near destruction and the memory of a cosmic rebellion. These two aspects were inseparable. The teachings about metals and stars and enchantments were not neutral facts that had been innocently misunderstood. They were gifts stolen from heaven, revealed by angels who had betrayed their stations, weaponized by giants who should never have existed. The information itself was embedded in a narrative of transgression, and that narrative gave it meaning and context. To preserve the knowledge was to preserve the warning. Future generations would need to understand what had happened before the flood. They would need to know about the Watchers and their descent, about the Nephilim and their violence, about the corruption that had filled the earth. Without this understanding, they would be vulnerable to repeating the same patterns. If rebellious angels or their spiritual descendants ever again attempted to cross boundaries, humanity needed to recognize what was occurring and resist it. The sealing created a category that had not existed before: forbidden knowledge. In the beginning, before the Watchers descended, knowledge was simply revealed or unrevealed. God taught what humanity needed to know through natural discovery and occasional direct instruction. The Watchers introduced a new kind of knowledge, revealed prematurely, taught in violation of divine order, inherently tainted by the manner of its transmission. And the sealing after the flood formalized this category, marking certain knowledge as dangerous, restricted, requiring special wisdom to approach safely. It was locked away, not destroyed. The difference matters. Destruction would have been absolute, leaving no trace, no possibility of recovery. Locking away implies protection, containment, the possibility of eventual access under the right conditions. The knowledge was placed in a kind of cosmic vault, secured but not eliminated, waiting for a time when it might be understood without repeating the old catastrophe. When might that time come? The texts do not say explicitly. Perhaps when humanity had developed sufficient moral maturity, sufficient wisdom, sufficient reverence for divine order. Perhaps when the memory of the flood had become clear enough that the warnings could be heeded. Perhaps never, with the sealing meant to be permanent, the knowledge remaining locked until the final judgment when all secrets would be revealed and all accounts settled. The waters rose, and the old world disappeared beneath them. But in the ark, floating above the submerged earth, Noah carried not just his family and the animals but the memory of what had been. He had seen the corruption. He had witnessed the violence. He had heard the stories of the Watchers and their teachings, and whether through texts he had brought aboard or through oral tradition he had memorized, he preserved the account for transmission to the world that would emerge after the waters receded. The sealing was complete as the flood reached its height. The tablets buried in hidden places were covered by water and mud. The chambers sealed in mountains were surrounded by the deluge. The knowledge inscribed on stone and metal waited in darkness, protected by layers of earth and water, inaccessible to any who might have sought it. And in the ark, the preserved records lay secure, guarded by the one man who had found grace, protected by the vessel that represented divine mercy. This was the extraordinary thing that occurred before the flood consumed the earth, not the destruction of knowledge, but its careful preservation. The Watchers had stolen from heaven and given to humanity what should not have been given. Humanity had misused these gifts catastrophically. And now, in the moment between judgment pronounced and judgment executed, the knowledge was sealed, locked away, preserved in a form that would allow it to serve as warning without serving as weapon. The age of the Nephilim was ending. The age of the flood was beginning. And the knowledge that had poisoned one age would be carried, sealed and hidden into the next, waiting for those who would have wisdom enough to remember without repeating, to understand without practicing, to know the danger without falling into it again. After the flood, the world was remade, but the past was not erased. The waters receded. New soil emerged. Seeds sprouted in ground that had once been buried beneath the deep. Families grew from the sons of Noah, and nations slowly began to form. Yet beneath this fresh beginning lay an older story, buried but not forgotten, sealed but not destroyed. The judgment had cleansed the earth, but the memory of what had brought that judgment lingered like an echo in the hills and valleys of the renewed world. As generations passed, and humanity spread once more across the face of the earth, certain places bore strange marks, stones arranged with unnatural precision, ruins whose foundations did not match the scale of ordinary men, fragments of inscriptions in languages no one fully understood. These were remnants of a world that had perished, faint traces of an age when giants walked the earth and angels had defied their stations. Most walked past such traces without understanding. But there were some who stopped, some who wondered, some who listened for the faint voice of history speaking through broken stone. Among these were prophets, scribes, and seekers of ancient wisdom. They were not content with the stories that began after the flood. They asked what had come before. They listened to elders who carried fragments of memory, to traditions that had survived in whispers and half-remembered tales. In time, their searching led them to texts, to inscriptions, to teachings that did not belong to the world as they knew it. These writings seemed older than the nations that now filled the earth. They spoke of beings and events for which ordinary history had no place. The Book of Enoch stood among these rediscoveries like a hidden lantern in a dark room, preserved first among the people of Israel and later guarded with special reverence in Ethiopian Christian communities. It spoke openly of the Watchers, of their descent, of their oath, of the giants that followed. It named the angels who had taught forbidden things. It described the corruption of the old world and the decree of heaven that brought the flood. Where the brief lines of Genesis left much unsaid, this book unfolded a longer, more detailed remembrance of the age before the waters. Other writings carried similar themes, though often in quieter tones. The Book of Jubilees retold early history with added detail, marking times and seasons and hinting at secret knowledge given and judged. Jasher, in its later form, preserved expanded narratives of patriarchs and kings, echoing fragments of older traditions. The Testament of Solomon spoke of spirits and those who bound them, reflecting dim memories of knowledge once misused by giants and those who followed their ways. Each of these texts, in its own manner, pointed backward toward a world drowned, yet not entirely silenced. Those who found such writings did not always understand what they had uncovered. Yet in the ruins of memory, in the scattered stones of pre-flood echoes, they sensed that the past still spoke. It spoke of rebellion and judgment, of knowledge given and misused, of a line that had once been crossed with consequences that reached even into their own age. And the more they read, the more a question began to rise within them, quiet yet pressing. What was to be done with such knowledge now that it had surfaced again? These texts were not widely accepted into the canon of Scripture, yet they were not entirely discarded. The Book of Enoch, though preserved in its entirety only in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, had once been known and respected across early Jewish and Christian communities. Fragments survived among the Dead Sea Scrolls, proving its ancient circulation. The Book of Jubilees similarly found preservation in Ethiopian Christianity and among certain Jewish communities, with multiple copies discovered at Qumran. These works occupied a strange middle ground, neither fully embraced nor completely rejected. The prophets and scribes who encountered these writings faced a profound dilemma. The text spoke of dangers that seemed disturbingly relevant. They described how angels had crossed boundaries, how forbidden knowledge had corrupted an entire generation, how judgment had followed transgression. These were not merely historical curiosities. They were warnings. But how could such warnings be shared without creating the very dangers they described? If a prophet stood in the marketplace and proclaimed the full content of what the watchers had taught, the specific methods of enchantment, the precise rituals of summoning, the detailed practices of manipulation, would he not be teaching the very things that should remain sealed? If he spoke openly about the knowledge that had poisoned the old world, might he not inadvertently plant seeds of curiosity in hearts that should remain innocent of such things? This was the paradox they struggled with. To warn effectively, they needed to speak clearly enough. Hat people would understand the danger, but to speak too clearly was to risk becoming teachers of the forbidden, guides toward the very practices they meant to condemn. The line between warning and instruction was thin, easily crossed by those who did not exercise great care. Some chose to speak in veiled language, using symbols and metaphors that would be understood by the wise but would pass over the heads of the foolish. They wrote of dragons and beasts, of stars falling from heaven, of waters that would come again. They encoded their warnings in prophecy and vision, trusting that those with spiritual discernment would grasp the meaning, while others would simply hear strange poetry. Others chose to preserve the texts themselves but restrict access to them. They kept the books in secure places, shared them only with students who had proven themselves trustworthy, taught the content only to those who had already demonstrated wisdom and restraint. The knowledge was maintained, but carefully guarded, passed down through chains of transmission that emphasized responsibility as much as information. Still others debated whether the text should be preserved at all. If the knowledge was so dangerous, if even speaking of it carried risk, perhaps the safest course was to let it disappear entirely. Let the memory fade. Let the old world remain buried beneath the flood waters, unremembered and therefore unrepeated. These voices argued for silence, for forgetting, for allowing time to erase what the waters had not. But those who advocated for preservation won the argument at least partially. They insisted that the past held lessons too important to forget. Without memory of what had happened before the flood, humanity would be vulnerable to the same deceptions, the same temptations, the same catastrophic errors. The texts must survive, they argued, not for common reading but for careful study by those charged with guarding the spiritual welfare of communities. And so the books were copied, hidden, transmitted through select channels. The Book of Enoch found its way into Ethiopian Christianity, where it was honored as scripture and preserved with care. Jubilees circulated among communities that valued expanded narratives of early history. Other texts survived in fragments, pieces of larger works that had been lost, hints of knowledge that had once been more fully expressed. The prophets who encountered this knowledge carried a burden that most would never understand. They stood between two dangers, the danger of forgetting what must be remembered, and the danger of revealing what must remain restricted. They were stewards of testimony, guardians of warning, keepers of a memory that could save or destroy depending on how it was handled. Some prophets integrated elements of this knowledge into their canonical writings, though always carefully, always with restraint. The brief verses in Genesis about the sons of God and the daughters of men, about the giants in the earth in those days, served as anchors for a much larger story that was not fully told in Scripture, but was preserved elsewhere. The prophets trusted that those who needed to understand more deeply would seek out the additional sources, while those who did not need such knowledge would be satisfied with the canonical summary. Others made direct reference to the pre-flood traditions in their teaching. The Apostle Jude, writing his brief letter in the New Testament, quoted directly from the Book of Enoch, citing its prophecy about the Lord coming with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment. This citation validated the text as containing true prophecy, even if it was not included in the canonical scriptures of most communities. It demonstrated that the knowledge preserved in these ancient books could be referenced, could inform teaching, could serve the purposes of warning and instruction when handled properly. The scholars who studied these texts in secret developed frameworks for understanding them. They distinguished between different kinds of knowledge, that which should be practiced, that which should be known but not practiced, and that which should be sealed entirely. Metallurgy, for instance, had become common after the flood and could be openly taught, though always with moral instruction about its proper use. But the specific enchantments and rituals described in some texts were placed in the category of known but not practiced, preserved as warning but never applied. The debate continued across centuries about what should be done with these rediscovered fragments. Some communities embraced them, incorporating them into their religious literature and teaching. Others rejected them, arguing that if they were not part of the canonical scriptures, they should not be studied at all. Still others took a middle position, acknowledging their historical and spiritual value while maintaining that they should not be treated with the same authority as accepted scripture. What remained constant across these different approaches was the recognition that the past still spoke. The ruins were not merely physical remnants of a destroyed world. They were testimonies, witnesses, reminders that rebellion carries consequences, that boundaries exist for reasons, that judgment follows transgression as surely as harvest follows planting. The prophets who found these fragments understood that they had uncovered more than historical curiosities. They had discovered warnings written in the blood and stone of an age that had perished. And so the knowledge remained in a state of tension, preserved but restricted, available but guarded, remembered but carefully contained. The prophets honored the memory of judgment by maintaining the record of what had led to it. They warned of ancient dangers by pointing to the texts that described them, while simultaneously cautioning against the practices those texts revealed. They walked the narrow path between amnesia and repetition, between forgetting too much and remembering too well. The world after the flood would never fully escape the shadow of what had come before. The sealed knowledge, though hidden, was not destroyed. The texts, though restricted, were not lost. And as humanity spread across the earth once more, building new civilizations and facing new temptations, the ancient warnings remained available to those with wisdom to seek them and restraint to handle them properly. The prophets had found fragments in the ruins, and through careful stewardship, they ensured that those fragments would continue to speak their warning to generations yet to come. To remember the knowledge of the giants was to carry a double-edged burden. The memory itself was heavy, weighted with both warning and longing, with both horror at what had been and curiosity about what might have been. Those who studied the preserved texts, who read the accounts of the watchers and their teachings, who pondered the fragments that had survived the flood, found themselves caught between two opposing poles, the duty to remember and the danger of remembering too well. On one hand, the knowledge served as a stark warning against rebellion, pride, and the misuse of power. The texts were clear about what had happened when boundaries were crossed. Angels had descended from their stations, and the result was catastrophe. Giants had walked the earth and violence had filled the land. Forbidden knowledge had been revealed and humanity had nearly destroyed itself. The pattern was unmistakable. Transgression leads to corruption, corruption leads to judgment, judgment leads to devastation. This was the lesson that must never be forgotten. The warning extended beyond the specific actions of the Watchers. It spoke to a deeper principle about the nature of knowledge and power. Not all information should be accessed. Not all abilities should be developed. Not all boundaries should be tested. There are limits built into creation, protective structures that allow life to flourish. When those limits are violated, when power is pursued without wisdom or reverence, the consequences ripple outward, affecting not just the transgressors but entire generations, entire worlds. Those who studied the texts with proper humility understood this. They read the accounts of metallurgy becoming the foundation of warfare and learned that tools must be guided by moral purpose. They studied the descriptions of astronomy becoming divination and learned that knowledge divorced from worship of the Creator becomes idolatry. They pondered the tales of enchantments and manipulation and learned that power over natural and spiritual forces must be approached with extreme caution, if at all. But there was another side to the burden, one that proved more difficult to bear. The knowledge contained echoes of abilities and insights that humanity, in its post-flood state, no longer possessed. The ancient world had known things about the stars, the spirits, and the forces of nature that were now fragmented and misunderstood. Reading the preserved texts was like looking through a window into a lost age of understanding, seeing dimly what had once been known clearly. The texts hinted at mastery of metals that went beyond simple forging. They described understanding of celestial movements that was both precise and comprehensive. They spoke of interaction with spiritual realms that was direct and immediate. And though these abilities had been misused catastrophically, the abilities themselves were impressive, even magnificent in scope. The post-flood world had lost this mastery, and the loss created a kind of cultural nostalgia, a longing for what the ancestors had possessed. This longing was dangerous. It tempted those who studied the texts to see them not as warnings but as instruction manuals, not as testimonies to judgment but as blueprints for restoration. If the ancients had known how to work metals in ways now forgotten, why not rediscover those methods? If they had understood the stars with precision now lost, why not reclaim that understanding? If they had wielded power over natural forces, why should that power remain sealed? The temptation was subtle because it dressed itself in reasonable clothing. Surely knowledge itself was not evil. Surely the problem had been misuse, not use. Surely with proper moral framework, with reverence and wisdom, the abilities described in the ancient texts could be reclaimed and wielded righteously. This line of thinking seemed sound, but it ignored the central lesson the texts themselves taught. Humanity had not been ready for such knowledge even when it was first revealed, and the catastrophe that followed proved the point definitively. Later generations looked back with a mixture of awe and dread. They marveled at what the ancients had accomplished, even while recognizing the terrible cost of those accomplishments. The preserved texts described abilities that seemed almost godlike from the perspective of those living in simpler times. The knowledge of the pre-flood world had enabled construction on scales that post-flood humanity struggled to match, understanding of natural forces that now seemed mysterious, mastery of techniques that had been lost or deliberately abandoned. The Tower of Babel became another attempt to reach heaven, to reclaim lost greatness through unity of language and ambition. The account in Genesis describes how humanity, still speaking a single language in the generations after the flood, gathered in the plain of Shinar and determined to build a city and a tower whose top would ray. The heavens. The stated purpose was to make a name for themselves, to establish greatness, to avoid being scattered across the earth. But beneath this stated purpose lay a deeper impulse, the desire to reclaim what had been lost, to demonstrate that humanity could achieve on its own what the ancients had achieved through forbidden knowledge. The tower was an act of pride, certainly, but it was also an act of nostalgia, an attempt to rebuild the glory of a vanished age without acknowledging why that age had vanished. It represented humanity's refusal to accept the limits that had been established, the boundaries that had been reinforced through judgment. And once again, divine intervention scattered the attempt. God confused their language so that they could no longer understand one another and scattered them across the face of the earth. The divine assessment was clear. Behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they began to do, and now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. Unity and ambition, divorced from reverence and proper limits, would lead humanity down the same path the pre-flood generation had walked. Scattering at Babel served as a second lesson, reinforcing the first. The knowledge preserved after the flood was never meant to be a blueprint for restoration. It was not an instruction manual for reclaiming lost abilities or rebuilding vanished glories. It was a memorial, a testimony, a record of what happens when boundaries are crossed and wisdom is divorced from reverence. The texts existed to teach humility, not to inspire mastery. They were meant to cultivate caution, not ambition. Those who studied these texts were called to humility, not mastery. They were to read and understand, not to replicate and rebuild. This distinction was crucial but difficult to maintain. Reading about ancient abilities naturally provoked questions about whether those abilities could be recovered. Understanding how the ancients had worked metals or read the stars created desire to work and read in similar ways. The texts themselves, by their very existence, tempted readers toward the path they warned against. The burden was heavy. Those who carried it felt the weight of conflicting impulses, the duty to remember warring against the temptation to restore, the call to preserve knowledge fighting against the wisdom of letting it remain sealed. Some managed to bear this burden faithfully, studying the texts with proper reverence, extracting lessons without attempting replication, maintaining the memorial without treating it as a manual. But many could not bear it without falling into the same temptations their ancestors faced. They read about the power of enchantments and began to experiment with similar practices. They studied the accounts of celestial knowledge and developed systems of divination. They learned about the metallurgy of the ancients and applied that knowledge to creating better weapons. The very texts that were meant to warn became, in careless or ambitious hands, tools for repeating old errors. This pattern repeated itself across generations and cultures. Each time the preserved texts surfaced, each time a scholar or seeker encountered the fragments of pre-flood knowledge, the same struggle ensued. Would the knowledge be honored as warning, or would it be mined for power? Would the reader approach with humility or with ambition? Would the memorial serve its intended purpose, or would it become exactly what it was meant to prevent? The communities that maintained these texts developed safeguards, traditions of interpretation that emphasize the warning aspects while downplaying the instructional elements. They taught that the books of Enoch and Jubilees existed to show what must never be repeated, not what might be reclaimed. They trained students to read with discernment, to extract moral lessons without absorbing practical methods. They created frameworks of commentary that surrounded the dangerous passages with warnings and prohibitions. Yet even these safeguards could not entirely prevent misuse. Human nature, drawn toward power and curious about what is hidden, found ways around the restrictions. Some students ignored their teachers' warnings and focused precisely on the passages they were told to avoid. Some seekers approached the texts without any guidance at all, reading them as neutral historical documents rather than as spiritually charged testimonies. The knowledge, once preserved, took on a life of its own, influencing readers in ways that could not always be controlled or predicted. The burden of remembering what was lost included the burden of watching others fail to bear it well. Those who studied the texts responsibly, who maintained proper humility and reverence, witnessed others falling into the very traps the texts described. They saw ambition dressed as scholarship, pride disguised as curiosity, rebellion asked as restoration, and they faced a difficult choice. Should they stop preserving the texts entirely to prevent such misuse, or continue preserving them despite the misuse, trusting that the warning value outweighed the danger? Most chose to continue. They recognized that without the memory of pre-flood catastrophe, humanity would be even more vulnerable to repeating it. Ignorance was not protection, it was vulnerability. The texts, dangerous though they were, served a necessary function. They testified that judgment had come once and could come again. They demonstrated that boundaries exist for reasons that transcend human understanding. They proved that power without wisdom leads to destruction, that knowledge without reverence produces corruption. The burden remained heavy because it required constant vigilance. Each generation had to learn anew the proper approach to these texts. Each student had to be taught not just what the text said, but how to read them without falling under their dangerous spell. The knowledge of the giants, preserved and sealed, demanded more than casual study. It required spiritual maturity, moral grounding, and the kind of humility that recognizes some doors should remain closed even when one possesses the key. Those who bore this burden faithfully understood that they were not guardians of treasure to be spent, but of warning to be heeded. The ancient world had possessed abilities now lost, but those abilities had come at a cost humanity could not afford to pay again. The knowledge echoed across the ages, whispering of what had been, tempting each generation to reach for what should remain beyond grasp. And the faithful carried the burden of remembering without repeating, of knowing without practicing, of preserving the memorial without treating it as a map back to lost power. The double edge cut both ways. To forget entirely was to invite repetition through ignorance. To remember too eagerly was to invite repetition through ambition. The narrow path between these dangers required constant attention, constant correction, constant return to the central lesson. The knowledge of the giants was sealed for a reason, and that reason remained valid no matter how much time passed, no matter how different the world appeared, no matter how confident later generations felt in their ability to handle what their ancestors could not. The burden was heavy, but it was necessary, and those who bore it faithfully, who studied with humility rather than ambition, who read to understand rather than to replicate, who preserved the warning without reopening the doors it warned against, these became guardians of a vital testimony, keepers of a memory that continued to speak across the centuries, reminding each generation that some knowledge is meant to remain sealed. Why preserve what should have been destroyed? This question has haunted theologians, historians, and seekers for millennia. It rises from the pages of the ancient texts like smoke from an altar, persistent and unavoidable. If the knowledge of the Watchers was so dangerous, if it led directly to the corruption that necessitated the flood, if it poisoned an entire generation and brought divine judgment upon the earth, why was it not obliterated entirely? Why allow even fragments to survive? Why seal rather than destroy? The question assumes a simple relationship between knowledge and evil, as if the proper response to dangerous information is always erasure. But the preservation of the pre-flood knowledge suggests a more complex understanding, a recognition that some things must be remembered precisely because they are dangerous, that warnings lose their power if the reasons for warning are forgotten. That testimony serves purposes that simple destruction cannot fulfill. Some suggest that God preserved it as a testimony to his justice, proof that judgment was warranted, not arbitrary. This view holds that the texts exist as evidence in a cosmic trial, demonstrating beyond doubt that the flood was not an act of divine caprice, but a necessary response to unbearable corruption. Without the record of what the Watchers taught and how that knowledge was misused, later generations might question whether judgment had been excessive, whether mercy should have extended further, whether the drowning of the world had been justified. The preserved texts answer such questions before they can take root. They describe in detail the violence that filled the earth, the wickedness that saturated human consciousness, the corruption that penetrated every level of existence. They name the fallen angels and specify their transgressions. They catalog the teachings that led to catastrophe. They provide a comprehensive account of why judgment became necessary, removing any basis for claiming that God acted hastily or harshly. This testimony serves not just historical purposes but theological ones. It establishes a principle that runs through all of Scripture, that judgment follows transgression according to patterns that are just and proportionate. The flood was not unique in this regard. It was the most dramatic example of a principle that operates at every scale, from individuals to nations to entire worlds. The preservation of the knowledge allows each generation to see this principle demonstrated clearly, to understand that boundaries matter and consequences follow their violation. Others believe the knowledge serves as a perpetual warning, a reminder that humanity is always one step away from repeating the failures of the past. This view emphasizes not the justification of past judgment but the prevention of future catastrophe. The texts exist to say, in effect, this happened once. It must never happen again. Remember what led to destruction so that you do not walk the same path. The warning is not abstract. It speaks to specific temptations that recur in every generation: the desire for power without accountability, the pursuit of knowledge without wisdom, the crossing of boundaries in service of ambition or curiosity. These temptations do not disappear simply because one generation fell to them and was judged. They persist, rising anew in each age, wearing different clothing but carrying the same essential character. The preserved texts allow those who study them to recognize these patterns when they emerge. When a culture begins to celebrate violence, when power becomes divorced from moral purpose, when knowledge is pursued without reverence for its source, the warning sounds. Those familiar with the pre-flood accounts can identify the signs, can call attention to the dangerous trajectory, can urge course correction before judgment becomes necessary again. This perpetual warning function explains why the texts were sealed rather than destroyed. They needed to survive, but they also needed to be difficult to access. The sealing created friction, ensuring that only those with serious purpose would encounter the knowledge, while preventing it from becoming common currency that might normalize the very practices it warned against. Still others propose that within the forbidden knowledge lies insight into the nature of creation itself, truths about the cosmos, the spiritual realm, and the structure of reality that, when understood rightly, can deepen reverence rather than fuel rebellion. This view acknowledges the danger, but suggests the knowledge also carries value beyond its warning function. The teachings about metals reveal something about the structure of matter. The astronomy reveals something about celestial order. The understanding of spiritual forces reveals something about the unseen dimensions of reality. The question becomes not whether the knowledge is true, but how it should be approached and for what purpose. Knowledge. That destroys when grasped in pride might edify when received in humility. Information that corrupts when pursued for power might enlighten when sought for understanding. The difference lies not in the content, but in the heart of the seeker and the framework within which the seeking occurs. This perspective finds support in the way Scripture itself handles the preserved texts. The Book of Enoch was quoted by the Apostle Jude in the New Testament, affirming its value even if not its full canonicity. Jude writes, "Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about these men also, saying, Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment on all, to convict all who are ungodly among them of all their ungodly deeds." This citation is significant. Jude, writing under inspiration, validates Enoch's prophecy and uses it to support his own warning about false teachers. He does not quote Enoch casually or accidentally. He invokes the ancient prophet by name, identifies him precisely as the seventh from Adam, and treats his words as authoritative testimony. The citation demonstrates that even texts not included in the formal canon can carry genuine prophetic insight, can serve legitimate teaching purposes, can be referenced by inspired writers without compromising their own authority. The fact that Jude quotes Enoch suggests that the preserved knowledge serves purposes beyond merely warning against repetition. It contains genuine insight into divine judgment, into the patterns of how God deals with rebellion, into the certainty that wickedness will be confronted and righteousness vindicated. These insights remain valuable across the ages, speaking to each generation that faces similar spiritual battles, similar temptations toward ungodliness, similar need for assurance that justice will prevail. The knowledge of the giants remains sealed in the sense that it is not openly practiced, yet it is accessible to those who seek with the right heart. This paradox captures the complex relationship between preservation and prohibition. The texts exist. They can be found by those who look for them. They have been copied, translated, studied across centuries and cultures. In that sense, they are not truly sealed. They are available. But they are sealed in another sense. They are not part of common knowledge. They are not taught openly in most religious communities. They are approached with caution by those who understand their nature. They require interpretation, context, guidance from those who have studied them responsibly. The accessibility is real, but it is guarded accessibility, availability that comes with warnings and frameworks and traditions of careful reading. This dual nature, accessible yet restricted, preserved yet prohibited, reflects a sophisticated understanding of how dangerous knowledge should be handled. Complete destruction would eliminate both the danger and the warning. Complete openness would spread the danger faster than the warning could take effect. The middle path of sealed preservation allows the warning to survive while limiting the danger, permits access while requiring intention and preparation. The answer may be that preservation and prohibition are not opposites. They are two sides of the same sacred responsibility. This understanding moves beyond the either-or thinking that frames the question in terms of destruction versus availability. It recognizes that sacred stewardship requires both maintaining what must not be lost and restricting what must not be freely accessed. The two impulses work together, not against each other. Preservation without prohibition would be reckless, making dangerous knowledge commonplace and inviting the very catastrophes it describes. Prohibition without preservation would be forgetful, allowing each generation to stumble blindly into errors that previous generations learned to avoid through terrible cost. The combination of both, preserving the texts while restricting their use, maintaining the record while sealing the practices, creates a sustainable relationship with knowledge that is both valuable and volatile. Those entrusted with this sacred responsibility throughout history understood that they served multiple purposes simultaneously. They were archivists, ensuring that ancient texts survived the decay of time and the upheavals of history. They were guardians, protecting the texts from those who would misuse them or from conditions that would destroy them. They were interpreters, providing frameworks that allowed the texts to be read safely, extracting wisdom without unleashing danger. And they were teachers, training the next generation in the proper approach to knowledge that must be remembered but not repeated. This multi-layered responsibility required wisdom that went beyond simple rules. It was not enough to say, preserve these texts or prohibit these practices. The task demanded discernment about when to speak and when to remain silent, when to reveal and when to conceal, when to make texts available, and when to keep them hidden. Different situations called for different responses, and those who bore the responsibility had to navigate constantly between competing concerns. The question that echoes through the ages, why preserve what should have been destroyed, ultimately reveals a deeper question about the nature of knowledge itself. Is information ever truly neutral, or does all knowledge carry moral weight? Can dangerous truths serve good purposes if handled correctly? Is humanity capable of learning from past mistakes without being given detailed accounts of what those mistakes were? These philosophical questions have no simple answers, but the preservation of the pre-flood knowledge suggests that the ancients answered them in a particular way. They chose to believe that knowledge, even dangerous knowledge, serves purposes beyond its immediate practical application. That testimony matters. That warning requires specificity. That understanding why boundaries exist strengthens commitment to honoring them. That the record of judgment, preserved in detail, serves as ongoing reminder that actions have consequences, that rebellion brings reckoning, that corruption cannot continue indefinitely without response. The sealed knowledge of the giants stands as monument to these convictions. It testifies that the past speaks to the present, that ancient wisdom remains relevant across millennia, that the patterns of transgression and judgment repeat unless they are recognized and resisted. The texts exist not to be practiced, but to be pondered, not to be replicated, but to be remembered, not to fuel ambition, but to inspire humility. Those who approach these texts with the right heart, with reverence rather than presumption, with desire to learn rather than desire to master, with recognition that some doors should remain closed even when one holds the key, find in them resources for wisdom that transcend their dangerous content. They discover that the knowledge of the Watchers, sealed and preserved, warns against more than just specific practices. It warns against attitudes, against patterns of thinking, against the subtle pride that imagines it can handle what previous generations could not. The question echoes still. Each generation that encounters the preserved texts must answer anew, why were these things not destroyed? And each generation that answers faithfully comes to recognize that preservation and prohibition together serve purposes that neither could accomplish alone. The knowledge remains, sealed but not silenced, accessible but not common, dangerous but not without value. And in this paradoxical state, it continues to fulfill the sacred responsibility for which it was preserved, to warn, to testify, to remind that boundaries exist for reasons that wisdom honors even when pride questions them. The echoing question finds its answer not in a single explanation, but in the ongoing practice of sacred stewardship. The knowledge was preserved because some things must be remembered. It was sealed because some things must be restricted. And the tension between these two truths, maintained across centuries by those who understood their sacred responsibility, ensures that the testimony remains while the danger is contained, that the warning sounds while the practices are prohibited, that the past speaks to the present without demanding that the present repeat what the past endured. The story of the giants and their preserved knowledge ends not with a dramatic revelation, but with a quiet invitation to rest. There is no final unlocking of sealed chambers, no climactic discovery of hidden tablets, no moment when all questions are answered and all mysteries resolved. The narrative does not build towards spectacle. Instead, it settles into stillness, like dust falling after a great wind has passed, like waters calming after a storm has spent its fury. The ancient world rose and fell. This is the simple truth that frames everything that has been told. There was a time before the flood when angels walked among men, when giants dominated the earth, when forbidden knowledge flowed like water through every community and culture. That world existed. It was real. Its power was genuine, its corruption profound, its violence catastrophic. And then it ended. The waters rose and covered everything, and when they receded, the old world was gone. The knowledge was sealed, not destroyed, as has been said, but deliberately preserved in forms that would limit access while maintaining testimony. The teachings of the Watchers, the practices of the Nephilim, the understanding of metals and stars and spirits, all of it was gathered, recorded, buried, hidden. Some in stone, some in metal, some in texts that would pass through careful hands across generations. The sealing was intentional, purposeful, an act of sacred responsibility that recognized both the value and the danger of what was being preserved. The judgment came and passed. The flood was not the end of all things, though it was the end of that age. The waters rose for 40 days and covered the highest mountains. Everything that breathed air and walked on land perished, except those preserved in the ark. The judgment was absolute within its scope, but its scope was limited. It cleansed the earth but did not destroy it. It removed the corrupted generation but allowed for a new beginning. It demonstrated divine justice while maintaining space for divine mercy. And in the aftermath, a new covenant was established, one built not on the secrets of angels or the strength of giants, but on obedience, humility, and trust in the Creator. Noah emerged from the ark into a world washed clean, empty of the violence and wickedness that had filled the old earth. God established a covenant with him, promising never again to destroy all life by flood, setting the rainbow in the sky as a sign of this promise. The terms of the covenant were simple: be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, live in reverence for the one who had preserved them through judgment. This new covenant did not depend on special knowledge or extraordinary power. It did not require access to angelic secrets or mastery of forbidden arts. It was founded on relationship rather than information, on trust rather than technique, on humble obedience rather than ambitious achievement. The contrast with the pre-flood world could not have been sharper. What the Watchers had offered, knowledge, power, elevation above ordinary human limitations, was replaced with what God offered: covenant, protection, purpose within proper boundaries. The knowledge remains, but in a different state than before the flood. It is buried in texts that few read and fewer understand. The Book of Enoch survives in Ethiopian Christianity, honored as scripture by some, studied as Apocrypha by others. Jubilees and Jasher circulate in limited communities, preserved by those who value ancient testimony. Fragments appear in Dead Sea caves, in monastic libraries, in the collections of scholars who dedicate their lives to understanding what the ancients knew and recorded. But even as it remains, it is no longer active in the way it once was. The knowledge does not shape entire civilizations as it did before the flood. It does not flow freely through human consciousness, corrupting thought and fueling violence. It does not serve as foundation for cultures built on the transgression of boundaries and the pursuit of power without wisdom. Instead, it rests in the pages of history, a monument to what was and what must never be again. For those who have walked this journey through the story of the Watchers and the Nephilim, through the corruption and the judgment, through the sealing and the preservation, the lesson is clear. There are boundaries established for a reason. These boundaries are not arbitrary restrictions meant to limit human flourishing. They are protective structures, part of the design of creation itself, meant to allow life to develop in sustainable ways. When those boundaries are honored, creation thrives. When they are violated, corruption follows. The boundaries between heaven and earth exist so that each realm can function according to its nature. Angels belong to their stations, humans to theirs. The crossing of that boundary by the Watchers initiated the cascade of corruption that required judgment. The boundaries around sea. Arcane kinds of knowledge exist because humanity needs time to develop wisdom before encountering power. Premature access to advanced understanding produces not enlightenment but catastrophe, as the pre-flood world demonstrated beyond question. There is wisdom in accepting what is revealed and leaving sealed what is hidden. This principle runs counter to the modern impulse that values unlimited access to information, that treats all knowledge as equally appropriate for all people at all times. But the story of the sealed knowledge suggests a more nuanced understanding. Some truths are meant for all, revealed openly and taught freely. Other truths are meant for few, accessible only to those prepared by wisdom and maturity to handle them safely. And still other truths are meant to remain sealed entirely, known about but not known fully, testified to but not practiced. The wisdom lies in discerning which category a particular piece of knowledge belongs to, and then acting accordingly. Not all that can be known should be pursued. Not all doors that can be opened should be entered. Not all questions that can be asked have answers that should be sought. The mature response to sealed knowledge is not persistent effort to unseal it, but acceptance that the sealing serves purposes worth honoring. The flood was both an end and a beginning. It ended the age of the Nephilim, the age of violence and corruption, the age when wickedness saturated human consciousness so completely that every intent was evil continually. That world could not be reformed. It could only be ended, washed away, removed so thoroughly that nothing remained of its physical structures. The flood accomplished this ending with finality. But the same waters that ended the old world made possible the new. The earth emerged cleansed, ready for a fresh start. The handful of survivors carried forward the human story, but without the corruption that had characterized the previous generation. The animals that came forth from the ark could repopulate the earth without the predatory Nephilim consuming them. The flood was destructive, yes, but its destruction served renewal. The ending made space for beginning. The sealing of knowledge was both a judgment and a mercy. It was judgment in that it acknowledged the knowledge had been misused so catastrophically that it could not be left freely available. The teachings of the Watchers had contributed directly to the corruption that necessitated the flood. To leave such knowledge unsealed would be to invite repetition of the catastrophe. The sealing was an act of judgment against the misuse, a recognition that humanity had proven itself unready for such power. But it was also mercy in that the knowledge was not destroyed entirely. Future generations would need to know what had happened, would need to understand why judgment had come, would need the warning that the sealed texts provided. The mercy lay in preserving the testimony while restricting the practices, in maintaining the record while limiting access, in allowing the past to speak to the future without demanding that the future repeat the past's errors. And now, as the story closes, there is an invitation, not a command, but an invitation, to lay down the questions that have no answers, to release the burden of seeking what should not be sought, to find peace in the knowledge that some things are meant to remain beyond reach. The invitation recognizes that the human mind naturally reaches toward mystery, naturally seeks to understand what is hidden, naturally pushes against boundaries to see what lies beyond them. But there is peace in acceptance, in recognizing that not every question requires an answer, that not every mystery needs to be solved, that not every sealed thing must be opened. The invitation is to rest in what has been revealed rather than strain after what remains hidden, to find sufficiency in the knowledge that is given rather than dissatisfaction in the knowledge that is withheld. The night is long. These words acknowledge the reality that the journey through this story has covered difficult terrain. The tale of the Watchers and their descent, of the Nephilim and their violence, of corruption and judgment and sealed knowledge, these are heavy themes. They speak of rebellion and consequence, of boundaries crossed and prices paid, of an entire world drowned beneath divine judgment. Such themes do not offer easy comfort or simple reassurance. The night has been long because the story itself is ancient, reaching back to the earliest days of human history, to the generations before the flood when the world was young and the consequences of rebellion were still unfolding. The night has been long because the questions raised by this story, about knowledge and power, about boundaries and judgment, about what should be preserved and what should be prohibited, have no simple answers. They require thought, reflection, wrestling with tensions that cannot be easily resolved. But even the longest night eventually gives way to dawn. Even the most difficult journey eventually reaches its destination. And this story, which began with angels descending and boundaries breaking, which passed through violence and corruption and catastrophic judgment, which moved through sealing and preservation, and the careful stewardship of dangerous knowledge, this story comes now to its close. The story is complete, not in the sense that every question has been answered or every mystery solved, but in the sense that what needed to be told has been told. The account of the Watchers and the Nephilim, the description of forbidden knowledge and its consequences, the explanation of how that knowledge was sealed and why it was preserved, the exploration of how later generations encountered these texts and struggled with their burden. All of this has been laid out, presented, offered for understanding. Let the ancient secrets rest. This is the final invitation, the gentle suggestion that concludes the journey. The secrets of the Watchers, the knowledge of the Nephilim, the practices that corrupted the old world. Let them remain where they have been placed, sealed in texts that few read, buried in fragments that require dedication to uncover, hidden in ways that protect the unprepared while allowing the wise to find what they need for warning rather than practice. The secrets are not calling out to be discovered. They are not demanding attention or promising power to those who seek them. They rest quietly in their sealed state, serving their purpose as memorial and warning without needing to become active again. The appropriate response is not to disturb this rest, not to dig up what has been buried, not to unseal what has been closed. The appropriate response is to let the secrets rest, to honor the sealing, to receive the warning without seeking the practices it warns against. And let sleep come gently. These final words shift from the ancient past to the present moment, from the story that has been told to the listener who has heard it. The journey through this narrative has required attention, focus, engagement with difficult themes and uncomfortable truths. But now the journey is complete. The story has been told. The warning has been sounded. The lesson has been offered. What remains is rest, not the troubled sleep that comes from unresolved anxiety or unanswered questions, but the peaceful rest that comes from having reached a natural conclusion, from having received what was offered, from being able to lay down the burden of seeking and simply receive. The sleep comes gently because there is nothing left that must be done, no remaining task that demands completion, no urgent question that requires immediate answer. The knowledge of the giants remains sealed. The texts survive in their restricted forms. The warning continues to sound across the ages. But for those who have heard the story, who have understood its lessons, who have grasped why boundaries exist and why some knowledge must remain sealed, there is permission to rest, to stop striving after what should not be sought, to find peace in what has been revealed, to accept that some things are meant to remain beyond reach, and that this is not deprivation but protection. The ancient world rose and fell. The flood came and passed. The knowledge was sealed and preserved. And now, in the quiet that follows the telling, there is rest. Not the end of all stories, but the end of this one. Not the answer to all questions, but the completion of this journey. The night has been long, but sleep comes gently to those who lay down their striving and accept the invitation to rest in what has been given rather than reach for what has been withheld. Let the ancient secrets rest, and in that rest let peace settle like dew upon the earth.